biggest thing I saw was the responsibility was put on me. And one of our friends had said, he spoke into the situation when it was happening, and he said that is what every church does, is they will lean into the healthy person because they get a response and they feel like they're going to get a result. They know the guy across the table, he's never changing. They instinctively know it. But if they can fix the wife and get it back together, it looks good in their numbers.
I'm Todd, and I was naughty. I did everything wrong. I got kicked out of art school, I drank heavily, and I looked to other religions and versions of spirituality to get fulfilled. The problem was, I was in the occult and I didn't even know it. My life was a wreck, and I had to learn what it meant to have a relationship with Jesus.
And I'm Laura. I was super nice. I did everything right. I got saved young, went to Moody Bible Institute, got married, and followed the Christian rules to having a good life. Problem was, that formula didn't work. I had to change how I related with Jesus.
At the end of the day, what I learned is the very simple truth. Jesus is the answer, and the only one that will ever actually fulfill you.
Naughty
versus
nice.
And welcome back to Naughty versus Nice. I'm Todd.
And I'm Laura.
I'm Kelly.
There we go, dear.
I didn't realize you were waiting for me.
I was giving you the look, but all the stuff's blocking it, so, you know. So Laura and I have been doing a series talking about some issues that happen within the church, whether we want them to or not, and we're talking a little bit more on the fringe edges of this topic. It's not like we, would definitely say everybody needs to get a divorce. We're talking about marriage, we're talking about divorce, we're talking about specifically abuse showing up within that relationship. It is a covenantal relationship. It is definitely a gift from God, the marriage itself. And when abuse does show up within that, there's a difference between, oops, I made a mistake, or I just got, something got out of hand, something showed up the way I didn't intend, versus a repeated pattern of malicious, planned, methodical harm.
The really awful things that I've heard, you can't hear those and then say, well, it was just an off day. Like every married couple, I always say, are you really married if you don't have a moment when you wish you hadn't gotten married? So that's all normal. But what we have though is people in the church and leadership start looking and examining these other kinds of marriages through the lens of how they understand it. Oh, well, for a few months I was kind of in a rough spot. They're normal and they can't accept that other people are not. And that's, I think, the biggest issue, especially with these more extreme ones. I think there's room to grow in seeing relationships more nuanced in leadership anyway, but for sure with what we're talking about.
Everybody has good days. Everybody has bad days. Like I always say, some days you're the bug, some days you're the windshield, and that can even last for a few months at a time. You have the sads, and it just takes you a little bit of time in order to turn things around. Any number of tragedy can strike in anybody's life, and it can take you some time to recover from that. And you could be cranky and maybe a little bit loose with your mouth when you probably shouldn't, but in the extenuating circumstances, these are all understandable things. We're talking about the things that go past being able to be understood readily, to the point where there's a difference between understanding, how you had a rough day versus now you're making up excuses.
Well, and there's also, I think I compared marriage to teenagers last week too, but each of my kids, as they reach that point where they're about to launch, we've talked about this because you've said it's normal, they begin to be miserable to be with. And it's not, I don't have any situation where they're chewing me out and disrespect and showing up late. That's not what it is. It's just a withdrawal. You feel like you have to kind of tiptoe around them. But at the end of the day, I just threw that out there, I have never looked at one of my kids and thought, oh, they were abusive. Like it's such a different thing that you have to, it can't ever look like the normal marriage. It's something other.
Yeah, that is normal behavior. Most kids will go through something like that, especially if they're leaving for college for the first time. They need to push everybody they love, all the safety and security of everything. They're about to enter into an unknown, and they need to kind of push everything out and isolate themselves in a weird, not isolate, but like give themselves a larger berth, a larger breathing room, so they can go out and tackle a lot of the unknowns and do it with a a little bit more zeal and gusto instead of clinging onto home so much. So we were talking just a second about, you had mentioned leadership. And part of the Christian walk, part of the Christian life, of course, is being involved with the body. And part of that being involved with the body, ideally you're involved with a church, in which case there is church leadership. There is a structure to things, depending on the size of your church, how big it is. And in many cases and in many ways, whenever something's going sideways in a marriage, that's going to be one of the first places a lot of people go and turn to. And in which case, we'll have a disproportionate amount of weight that we'll put on the response or the reaction or the interaction we have with church leadership versus, say, your cousin from Philly, for example, who's always got a mustard stain on his shirt. We're going to have a heavier weight that we put on what leadership has to say.
And I'm not quite sure where you wanted to launch from, but I have alluded to before in the previous episodes of bad experiences of my own. I have heard other bad experiences, but on these episodes, I'm trying to draw from either something I've read clinically or my own experience, so nobody feels like I've leaked something that has been confided to me. But I had a pretty average experience with the church as things unfolded in the marriage. So, but did you want to address something before we went into
I want to jump in and we'll talk a little bit about one aspect with Scripture. The thing I want to kind of give a disclaimer, so to speak. Look, nobody's perfect. You've got a bunch of people. They're not like licensed therapists that are involved in leadership. These are good men called by God. They want to serve their people and serve the community, and mostly they're thinking in capacity of spiritual leadership. They're thinking of managerial aspects, managing the money, making sure there's plenty of chairs for the people that are coming in, and making sure the lights are are on and the grass is mowed. They're not thinking of, we've got a sociopath married to somebody in the body and they're threatening to harm their wife. Now we need to go jump in and help. That's not even on the radar. So when we talk about these things in their points of pain points that exist within the church itself, this isn't a horrifying criticism. It's not something to lambaste the church over. It's just recognizing we understand and we see, but this is something, if you're going to be doing this volunteer work, this work, and shepherding, you need to step up and do the whole thing, not just what you feel comfortable with in the area. You're called to serve the entire body, not just a portion.
And I think I don't want to undo your disclaimer by anything I say now. I agree. The people, each and every person, the people who did well and did poorly in my situation meant well. There wasn't anyone in the situation that was setting out to fail at this. And I don't not see that. You have to have grace for people, how they handled things with what they knew. My push is going to be, but now you have an opportunity because it's too apparent in culture, and you're hearing, if nothing else, you're hearing these episodes and you're accountable. And so I can't continue to see this happening over and over and over and not have my voice get louder against it, because it's wrong and you are not doing well. And that sounds mean and such, but I feel like this is such a problem in the church that I can only dismiss the seeing of it for so long. And you're doing real damage. And I think it's time to do better.
Well, I don't think it's just us. I want to mention a concept here. Now, within the book of Revelation, one of the more mysterious of all of them, or difficult to understand, in the very beginning of it, we get a series of letters that Jesus is basically dictating to John. Specifically, we assume it's the John of the Bible that Jesus hung out with, in person. Could be a different one, I suppose. We don't really get specifics on that. But everybody basically assumes it's, the John. And he writes to 7 churches. Now, within this, Jesus gives some criticisms, he gives some compliments, and he's got kind of a general, well-rounded thing to say about specific issues with specific churches, like even many of the writings that Paul has. However, there is one church, and it's the last church, that Jesus doesn't have anything nice to say about at all. And that's the church of Laodicea. Now, inside of this interpretive concept of Revelation, there's many different ways to interpret it. Part of, or one of the ideas is just the idea of this church ages. So it's not just real churches with real problems that John's writing real letters to, but these churches are also spiritually symbolic of the actual ages and the changes that the actual church goes through over 2,000 years to where we're at right now. Many people that have this viewpoint make the argument we appear to be in what's known as the final church age, or the age of Laodicea. Now, what Jesus has to say regarding Laodicea is, I know your deeds, and this is, by the way, this is Revelation 3, and this is, between 14 and 22. I'm just going to kind of jump around here. Jesus says, I know your deeds. You are neither cold nor hot, and I wish you were one or the other. So because you are lukewarm, neither hot nor cold, I am about to spit you out of my mouth. It's like, ooh, Mm-hmm. You say I am rich. I have acquired wealth. You do not need a thing, but you do not realize that you are wretched, pitiful, poor, blind, and naked. This is, out of all the churches, the only one that Jesus doesn't exactly give a compliment to. He'll point out some stuff that's wrong with some of the other churches, but he's usually got a backup to it. But hey, you guys are real great in this area. Laodicea, not so much.
And the way I've heard this taught in the past is that the lukewarmness is that you're on fire for the Lordness. I don't know what else to call that. And I don't actually think that's what it is. I think because that isn't the call on the church, is not to be more motivated to evangelize. The call on the church is to be intimately bound to the Trinity, to grow in that relationship, to transform within the environment of the body, and to reach out to a world with a testimony that comes from that relationship. So for him to want to spit you out, it's not that you don't want to go hand out tracts enough. It's that you have no intimacy with him.
And that's exactly correct. Jesus himself even kind of bolsters that idea in verse 19 when he says, those whom I love, I rebuke and discipline. So be earnest and repent. Here I am. I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice, open the door. I will come and eat with that person and they with me. So once again, the idea of that you and me and I and you, and not only that, but Jesus is like knocking at the door, like, let me in, let me in. And the church is on the inside saying, no, we're fine, thanks. We'll just do our Jesusing the way we've been doing it. It makes us comfortable. And Jesus doesn't exactly have anything nice to say. So the concept that we see here is sort of like spiritual blindness. And Jesus refers, the way that it's talked about, I think there's an association with the concept of what we've talked about in past episodes regarding the concept of cultural Christianity. Going through the motions, presenting as Christian, but not necessarily being so. Not necessarily making Christ the center and the figurehead and the Trinity concept and in the focus of your life. We've got an article here. It was called The Compromised Church is Rooted in Spiritual Blindness. This was posted in February of 2023 by Mike Ratliff. And in it, he references Romans 1, 24 and 25. Therefore, God gave them over to the lusts of their hearts to impurity, so that their bodies would be dishonored among them, for they exchanged the truth of God for a lie and worshiped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. So Mike then goes on to say, instead, the gospel is preached in a feel-good, pep talk kind of way that makes becoming Christian no more stressful than it is than buying a Coke in a convenience store. It's like, ooh.
I like this guy.
I know. The compromised church is very attractive to the world. Why not? After all, it's worldly. It has no requirements of repentance or denying of self or dying to the self. Why this matters. When you have a situation where abuse is going on inside of a marriage, and it's more than a misunderstanding, or an unfair projection of a misunderstanding. We're talking like legit harm is going on. And the church is not addressing it, they're not interacting with it, and they're not addressing it. it is this convenience store, buy a Coke, the ease of transaction kind of mentality, this spiritual blindness concept that I'm trying to show how it shows up today.
And I think that's why I feel more comfortable with my addendum to your disclaimer, because you see how adamantly and strongly Christ spoke to this attitude in the church. And then, of course, the author of this article is got a lot of strength to his attitude. And I don't think that's bad. And I feel like we're so sensitive to everything that we aren't going to say it. But when you look at Paul and you look at the prophets, when you understand something to be true and understand that God's people are not living in light of that truth, you ought to be this adamant.
We have a situation where Christians, as part of their worldview, go out and tell the unfiltered, unadulterated truth to people that don't want to hear it and don't want to acknowledge it, and the Christian is befuddled and can't figure out why. Here's why, guys. Because when somebody else inside the church has a truth to deliver to you, you don't want to hear it either. Not everyone, obviously, but it's not that far off. The associations are there. So in talking about this, you've had, with the story that you've shared so far, in the series that we've done, you had these run-ins with church leadership. You're obviously looking for help. You're looking for a place to go. The church, like I've said before, that's the second most intimate relationship anybody's going to have, any believer's going to have, with the exception of their spouse. You're going people that you trust and people you're seeking the guidance. You look at what they have to say and holds a lot of weight. What was your experience like? What kind of happened? Or even better yet, what are some of the experiences you've heard from other women that you've done and you've counseled with, and what actually happens?
Nothing really great. So my situation was kind of unique in that I had a lot of different people from different places in my life speaking into it. So I had a couple of good friends at the time who were also married, and they were kind of along for the ride. And then so they were speaking into it. I had my former youth pastor's wife, who is a mentor of mine, who has been in my life since I was 16. She was speaking into it. We had gone to our pastor. He was speaking into it. And so at times, you'd have versions of this group meeting. So one time we had a whole group meeting at a church, and, you got 13, 14 people sitting around the table, and we were separated at the time. So we're sitting on opposite ends of the table. And this feeds into the examples. He claimed that if he committed adultery, that by his definition of God's sovereignty, God would have led him to it and would be responsible for it. And everybody heard it. You could just see the whole room kind of move back like, what? But it's like the curtains would part like that. And because he was slippery with his words, then pretty soon everyone acted like nothing like that had been said. And you would think we had many such events where it was very, very obvious. There, I had been to counseling with him, and he had said, I will never, ever, ever look or purchase pornography again. And I kid you not, the next day it was on the bank statement. It was a package. It was some kind of program you could go through. Other people looked at it. It was porn. I can show you. He spent money. Right here. I brought that to the pastor, and he just looked like, yeah, I don't know what to do about that. Kind of like, well, I guess we'll say something. But then the next day, if my ex-husband seemed sorry or willing to think about it and work on it, I became the bad guy because I was still going, but yesterday he did this. And everyone's like, well, but today, now he is sorry about that. And we have to kind of go with what he is day to day. And that made no sense to me. I think that would be the biggest thing I saw was the responsibility was put on me. And one of our friends had said, he spoke into the situation when it was happening, and he said that is what every church does, is they will lean into the healthy person because they get a response and they feel like they're going to get a result. They know the guy across the table, he's never changing. They instinctively know it. But if they can fix the wife and get it back together, it looks good in their numbers. And I know that sounds harsh, but people are so afraid in leadership to do this openly, to make strong stands. They're, I don't know. And then They fail. And that again, the people who were involved, the pastor we had at the time, is a very kind man. It was not that he meant to do this poorly. He might not even think he did, but a lot of things unraveled, and it just showed a lot of the weakness in the church and how they're not ready for it. A couple things: the church does not have any preparedness to deal with pornography. If you're in church and a pastor mentions pornography from the pulpit, that's what they think talking about pornography is. That's not what talking about pornography is. So he had no idea how to handle a porn addict, no idea how to recognize somebody who had a sexual addiction, who had a personality disorder. And when those ideas were brought to him by counselors, he dismissed them because they're not found in the Bible. You can't look at the world that way anymore.
I would make some kind of argument that if you grabbed, let's just go with 500 people, put 500 people in a room, the number of them that have a can't resist donuts problem, maybe 2 or 3. The number of them that have a problem where they just deep down actually just want to hurt other people, maybe 4 or 5. And deep down, some people, you know what? They're just going to deny absolutely everything, and everything was great with their childhood, and mom and dad did the best they could, and that's all there is to it, and I don't even want to look at it. Let's go up to maybe 20 or 30. The number of people that have some kind of sexual proclivity, sexual difficulty, challenges, strife, aberration, right down to downright depravity, probably about 99%. And the people that don't, they're dead, or they're over 80. You know what? Like, so the idea that the church is acting like this isn't an issue, when to put it into comparison, it shocked me to go through public school and to know that money is something that every single teacher and every single facilitator and every single person that worked in that school, they dealt with it every single day in and out of their entire life. And at no time did they think over the course of, my 12 or 13 years in that public school system, did they ever teach anybody about money? They acted like it didn't exist. Same kind of concept. If the pastor doesn't know that sexual sin is a problem, he probably shouldn't be the pastor. You know kind of what I'm saying? Something's wrong with him. Mm-hmm. So this is, and then to act like, if you've got 500 people in your church and you've got a thriving youth group and you don't have some sort of porn program to help kids with it, or are doing a unit on it or anything like that, you're churching wrong.
All right. Episode over. So I think some of my own experiences and other people's stories will come out when I made a list. It's titled Instructions to Leaders Regarding Marital Abuse, and then subtitle is Learn It Now or Do It Wrong Later. So I might have a few strong feelings about these topics. I will say thematic, in case it doesn't come out in these 28 things I would say to leadership. I have been told by men, as I'm kind of banging my head going, this is a problem, that it's not a problem and men are handling it. And I am so frustrated with that, because I'm thinking of one situation, one case I dealt with. Absolutely everyone. And it wasn't just men, actually. It was females. It was the, quote, biblical counselors. It was teachers. It was pastors. And eventually it was her parents. And nobody stuck to their guns. Nobody saw it for what it was. It's just, it's incredibly frustrating to have people keep saying, no, if it's there, the church is going to see it. No, they're not. Because over and over and over, I'm seeing that not happen. And I do hold leadership accountable for that. That's what you've kind of signed on to do. So you need to do it, but do it well and do it better.
Well, whether you believe the idea of the church age or not, there is a parallel that we could make an argument, the concept of the Church of Laodicea, this lukewarm church, and the idea that there are problems that exist within the church and they don't seem to be addressing it or acting as though they're not as big of a problem as they really are. Once again, the parallel is there. And so Scripture backs up this idea. And and we're going to be using the Bible as our guide, we need to be able to have the courage, have the strength, and have the wisdom and the spiritual discernment to take those blinders off, pay attention to what's actually there, and then start moving forward and start doing what we need leadership to be doing. And once again, it's not all churches, and it's not everywhere, and it's not all of them. There are plenty that are out there that you and I have seen. One of the first things, the three of us do when we're looking at churches, okay, what's their sexual abuse policy of their church? Mm-hmm. How do they view and handle this? Do they have something they got the guts to publish and put online? And there are churches that do this. They're living in 2025 and acknowledging it. So this can be done, and this approach and taking a look at it. So why don't you go ahead and go over the list? These are things that that either you've had personal experience with or you've seen over and over again. This is something you're going to have more of an inside view on that I can contribute to.
Well, if I can get my old lady eyes adjusted. I'm sorry, trying to do well with that, with my microphone placement. Kelly's going to yell at me.
So the mean Kelly
she's so
doesn't
mean.
come over
She's
and
so
move
mean.
it.
My son's afraid of you after they've been in the studio before. He warned the others, if you ever go in, you better have your voice down. Okay, sorry. Number one, and I put it first for a reason. First, be willing to examine closely your existing leadership team. It is highly acknowledged that church leadership is more often than not populated by abusers and predators. So it's not a bad thing to just sit down and look in-house. Just pay attention. This is something else to kind of look for. Does the man have a wife who is honest, authentic, easygoing, a people pleaser, overly submissive, or too willing to take responsibility for things she shouldn't? If you've ever thought of the man, he's a little odd, brutish, vain, short-tempered, condescending, arrogant, irresponsible, or angry, evaluate if the kindness and normalcy of the wife isn't making the dysfunction of the husband not apparent. Have you guys seen that before with people you've dealt with? That it's kind of a stereotype, I guess. It's the word I'm looking for. It seems like more than not, that's what it looks like.
Yes. Usually the healthy one is very likable and nice. And so it's always like, well,
It offsets it.
Yeah. And so you don't want to upset the nice spouse by saying anything to the damaged one.
Well, and people came out of the woodwork over the last 13 years and been like, oh, yeah, I kind of thought something was wrong with him before you married him. I was like, wait, why didn't you tell me? Where were you? That's right. Thanks for that. Uh-huh. But what they said was sometimes he would seem odd, but you guys seemed happy and you were so normal. So we figured he had to be okay. So that's what you're looking at.
You were his beard.
I was. That's what I've called it. Is the beard. It's a different kind of beard, but yes, that's what it is. Number 3, does this man, when caught in an offense, seem almost undone? So crying, willing to give up the offensive behavior, and promising he'll do whatever it takes. When this happens, it is often the tendency of leadership to accept this as genuine repentance and then turn their attention toward the hurting wife and begin to place pressure on her to reconcile. I think we've mentioned that this episode, we've mentioned other episodes. I think if you're dealing with a couple and you think that this is the severity of the problems, I don't think you should talk about reconciliation. I think it's overemphasized at that point. I lived in terror because from day to day, I was getting these really crazy emails and I was sending them out to these group of people who were kind of working with me. And if there was a nice day, the table started tilting towards, you might have to take him back. Might have to. Like and it was just weird. I was like, oh, I might. I was terrified. So it doesn't need to be on the table. If you have a man who's really ready to work on something, it won't matter if that's on the table because it's not about the reconciliation of the marriage at that point.
They're willing to work within the parameters of the restrictions of the situation in order to do the work to reconcile themselves. When you have a situation where church leadership starts pressuring the one who did not commit the offense to be the one to reconcile, that is the incorrect position to have. It's not right. This is the same type of person that would say, well, he hasn't done anything to her yet, so therefore she needs to stay with him. Mm-hmm. Because hasn't done anything yet. It's putting the pressure on, and by the way, that's how you know if you're a woman in this situation and the church is pressuring you, That's how you know they all think you're the reasonable one, that you're the sane one, that you're the one that's not the problem. They all know it because they're not going to go to the crazy one, the difficult one, or the one that they're afraid of and start socially pressuring them to be the one to change, them to be the one to reconcile. They won't do it. That's also, by the way, I'm sorry to be a little bit blunt on this one, that's how you know that you have weak leadership. Because strength in leadership is doing what needs to be done, saying what needs to be saying, whether you want to do it or not, and whether you feel comfortable doing it or not, because that's what's required of you. If you have a situation where you have a potentially dangerous spouse and potentially where they might harm one of the members of your congregation, you're the defense. You're the line. You're the one that's supposed to stand up and go, no, we're not doing this. And no, we're not going to put pressure on Susie Bubblegum, okay? And she didn't do anything wrong. You're the one that committed the offense. You're the one that did this and that. We're going to work with you now, and we're going to, if you really want to repair this relationship and reconcile, you're going to be able to show that over the next 2 years because marriage is a lifetime, at least in this life,
And I don't think I have it written explicitly in this list, but in doing this in ministry, so either if it's elders or a pastor, if you are going to step into this arena, as I think you should, in an effort in these situations to protect and advocate for the woman, you should plan on losing people. There's going to be money and there's going to be people who leave your church because there's always loyalties, there's always sides on this. And I have seen that before where I think there's a fear of upsetting the flock. And so there's not wanting to do it. And I think that's not good at all. So you get this situation, you find that someone feels comfortable enough to come and approach you, which is a rare thing, especially with men in leadership, and you're going to enter in with her, you just better, count on you're going to lose some money and just decide not to care.
Or write into your bylaws, we will always do the right thing unless it costs us money. In which case we'll always cave,
So we talked about reconciliation in the last one. Number 4, true repentance will look less self-directed. So, for example, one who is truly repentant will take full ownership of the bad behavior and the results of that bad behavior. This includes accepting the consequences and new boundaries. I did deal with a healthy case once where the guy had come forward and said there had been pornography, and she was upset and hurt, but felt like she couldn't share that with anyone just out of respect for his reputation. And his response was that you tell whoever you need to, because this is something I've done, and you're the person who needs to be taken care of now. That's what you're looking for. I don't see that very often. So real repentance will show resolved dedication towards change. A repentant man will be content to pursue change regardless of if it will restore the marriage. I think we touched on that earlier. You don't see that very often, so it's worth repeating. So a pastor, when hearing the wife's side, you should have a female advocate with her. That is not to protect the image. I know normally when men counsel women, they keep another woman there or they keep it public or whatnot. That's not what I'm talking about. I am saying it is very hard to go into a room and start to share anything of what's going on with men, and especially if you're having it in a group. So there needs to be a friend that she picks or somebody in your ministry that advocates for women. I would encourage, when we do solutions, I think that's one of the ones I wanted to push is seek to establish that at least in your community, if not in your church. A woman who can do that. That's what I mean. I'm looking through for my best ones here. If there has been physical violence or threat of it, feel confident in telling her to leave immediately. Do not stress over if the need to leave is valid. There's less to lose in leaving than there is in the gamble of staying. A safe marriage cannot be harmed by a partner leaving the residence temporarily. There's no reason I should have stayed after what was said to me. There's no reason women should have to stay. You can feel confident. You can be wrong about it. You can be a pastor who it's rare, but would be duped and not understand the situation accurately and encourage the woman to leave. The worst thing that could be said is the husband's like, well, that was it. I'm not going to reconcile. Well, you already know what your problem is there. So I don't know, is that making sense?
I think it does. And once again, whether the marriage stays together or not, if the guy is a believer and this is all a misunderstanding or a very advanced or complicated one, the attempt to get right and to reconcile even with himself and with Christ and move forward and have that correct way in which that the Christ fruits come out, that's going to happen anyways. So there's no harm in any of that, if that makes if that makes sense.
There's not really a risk. The biggest risk, again, is you might lose face in your congregation, because if you miscall something, which we all do, then it can have that repercussion. But I feel like that can't be what counts at that point.
But it's not the same thing as a bunch of cops coming in and doing an investigation to find out what you knew and when. And by the way, we've got a funeral to arrange. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like, so the consequences of that are much greater than, oops, someone felt uncomfortable.
I agree. See, believe that patterns matter. We talk about that a lot in our group. We talk about that a lot in our episodes. You have to do not take the day-to-day behavior approach. You have to see the patterns. If abuse has been ongoing, it must be assumed to be a deep pattern of behavior. Again, a guy does not come out of the room doing these things that are so extreme, and it's like, oh, it's the first time and we've had 15 years of healthy marriage. That's not how it works. So when you see something pretty strong coming out, you've got to know there's so much worse that isn't being shown. We always say that's the iceberg tip. So even what the wife is willing to tell you is so much less than what is really happening, even when they're talking to me. So always see the pattern. Deep patterns are not quickly resolved, so the damage they've done needs to be acknowledged. We can't just be like, well, he's sorry now, and then we're trying to put everything back together. I see women who have taken back husbands and have this whole grieving process going on that everybody, including the husband, thinks she should be done with. And he's cheated on her. And no, she should, and she's kind of privately grieving and pressuring herself to be done. That's not how that should go.
I've given you this example before, kind of an analogy. It's marriage. We view marriage as being some kind of different thing, and it has different rules. So take the concept and put it into a more regular situation. If a guy goes in and robs a convenience store and threatens the clerk's life and steals all the money and then shoots or stabs the clerk in the legs, and then he makes off with it, right? He gets caught, okay? It's not up to the clerk to go apologize to the thief and to reconcile with the thief and make sure that the thief feels more comfortable being around him. It's not up to the clerk. But for whatever reason, whenever the one spouse breaks that covenant of marriage, cuts that ribbon, then we lean on the other spouse that didn't do anything wrong. We lean on the clerk to repair the relationship, make sure the other one feels better, and try to just put everything back together. That's not the case. The same way that you wouldn't have that expectation for the clerk to do it, we need to start readjusting the way that we look at it and start putting the onus on the one who is the breaker, who is the destroyer, and start pointing the fingers where they belong, if that makes sense.
And it's the unbiblical view of the permanency of covenant that I think is behind the push in this, because you have a man say he cheats on his wife, he's cut the ribbon, as we say, but he's sorry, and then the wife is pressured to take him back. In normal, like this gas station illustration, we wouldn't expect that, but because there's this view of covenant coming under something much more eternal or binding or even spiritual. I get it. Marriage is not an unspiritual thing. That's not what I'm saying. But the emphasis that has been placed on it has set a stage where we don't hold people accountable for things that have already harmed the covenant. The greater destruction that they're trying to avoid is her ending something that he already ended.
He already did, exactly.
And yeah. And I lived through it. I didn't see it when it was happening, but now I do. And I think don't do that. Don't trust an abuser's friends. By this, I mean that just because you trust Joe and he thinks Stan is incapable of evil, you should not dismiss your own misgivings or suspicious reports about Stan. This, I see, can happen in all kinds of relationships. We trust one another, and then we trust somebody we trust trusts, and then eventually we stop paying attention to the fact, just like I said, well, I thought your husband was kind of weird. Okay, well, You trusted him because you trusted me, and that wasn't probably.
How many times after the fact has somebody come up to you and said, you know what, there's always something off with that guy. I never would have been in that situation, though, so I'm glad you did something about it.
Lots.
Yeah.
A
But
lot.
at the time, did that person ever say that? No.
I've had people say, oh, yeah, I knew that he was like that. I was like, no, you didn't. Get out.
Not based on everything you said to me before.
You're lying.
Yeah.
That wasn't somebody in leadership, by the way. It was just somebody random. All right. Do not accept your own rationalizations or if somebody else is saying these things to you. He says, so the abuser, he says he loves Jesus, and aren't we all sinners and in need of grace and patience? Or what better place than the church for someone with issues to be? We wouldn't want to confront him and make him feel unwelcome. There's this fear of if we bring this conflict up, then he'll go away, and then he suddenly won't have any chance of redemption because he's not in the community of the church. I hear it all the time about a lot of issues, so don't let yourself say those things. You need to pay attention to the whole family. Learn what women and children look like in abuse situations. It's not always stark symptoms like the Lifetime Channel movies. Learn to look for subtleties. Something of that might be with children, if they're receiving an abusive environment and they're more of an introvert, they curl in more. So their posture will show you all the time. But people don't look for that. They kind of think that kid's just awkward. Where
are they positioning themselves in the room? Mm-hmm. Are they next to everybody else, or are they off in the corner and you didn't even realize it, but it's almost like you haven't seen them?
Or do they always keep a certain parent in the corner of their eye? They're always aware of where he or she is at every moment, on the lookout.
Or if they're doing, this would be seeing them more in a personal setting, but preventative. I used to do that. My mom worked with somebody who made her miserable, and she came home and took it out on all of us. And there was you couldn't evade having a fault. She'd find something to be upset with you about. But I would clean the house, and then that way when she got home emotionally, she wouldn't be able to be mad at me. And it worked. And so, but that's not normal. My kids certainly did not feel that kind of pressure. Just never.
I have this example that I use that Kelly reminded me of the other day. I call it the suitcase example. And just real quick, it goes like this. You've got the abuser, right? And they say, hey, my suitcase is by the door. Can you go ahead and take it and put it in the car for me? I'm going to go on the trip. So you go grab the suitcase, you pick it up, but it's unlatched. And it opens up and all the stuff goes everywhere. They come up to you and they yell at you. Why didn't you check to make sure it was latched first before you picked it up? Situation is reversed now. Your suitcase, you're the one going on the trip, and you talk to the abusive person, say, hey, can you do me a favor? Can you grab my suitcase, put it in the car? They grab onto it, they pick it up, same situation, it's unlatched, the stuff goes absolutely everywhere. They yell at you, why didn't you make sure to latch it before I grabbed onto it, before I picked it up? It's your fault. It's always your fault. It doesn't matter what the situation is. If you look at your interactions with this person and you're looking at a 50-50, 50% of the time they admit it's their fault, 50% of the time they apologize, and it goes back and forth like that, you're probably not in an abusive relationship. But if you're the one that's always at fault, 99% of the time, 98% of the time, and even when they're at fault, they still don't say they're sorry, that's a situation.
I agree. I usually say that when you get angry. I agree. It's my counselor voice. Mm-hmm.
Yes. Yeah, well, can you tell what actually happened to me at one point? That's where I got the example.
Well, something else on the list is I think it's important to learn abuse. I can't say it. Learn abuse statistics. I think this is accurate. We can be sure that if you are hit physically by a husband, this is male, female statistic, and you return to the home, you are 7 times more likely to be killed.
That's shocking.
If you are a pastor, know that statistic, because now you understand this person isn't like you. This person doesn't operate in your world, and this is a threat. You need to not keep sending people back. That's what I'm going to say.
The example of nothing's happened yet. He hasn't done anything yet. That's how you get to that situation. That's how you get there.
Mm-hmm. Oh,
yeah, I want to bring up, so I just watched the Gabby Petito American Murder on Netflix, and they show the body footage of them getting pulled over a few days before he killed her. And on the surface, it looks like she was the aggressor. So a bystander called the police and said, I just saw a man slapping a woman. They're in this kind of vehicle, and they went this direction. The police pull him over, and instantly, and the cop even says anything, she rolls down the window and says, everything's my fault. I did this. It's my fault that, he's done nothing. And she starts just taking on before the cops even asked her a question or asked him a question. They pull her out. She's crying, shaking, visibly very, very upset. And they pull him out of the car to talk to him, and he's cool as a cucumber. He's making jokes with the cops. He's making sly little comments like, the cop's like, what happened? He's like, well, she's crazy. He's like, oh, just kidding, And then he said something like, I hope she's saying nice things about me and stuff. And I was like, oh, he's probing to see what the cops say. And the cops were like, oh, yeah, she's saying nice things about you. So then he knows, okay, that she's doing what she's supposed to do. She's taking all the blame. And then he's making buddies with the cop. And so the cops then treat her as she's nothing more than an emotional woman. She went too far. He goes back to talk to her, and he tells her to take a shower and just go relax, take a hot shower, because his wife gets really upset sometimes too, and a shower helps her. And he separates them. But then when he's talking to Gabby, he says, it looks like you've been hit. What happened to your face? And then he's like, and there's a bruise on your arm. What happened there? And she's looking, and you can tell she's kind of like, what? And then he says, if he didn't do this to you, don't say he did, because that's wrong. So now she doesn't know in the whole argument, like what happened exactly, but she's showing physical signs that something had happened. But then he put it on her. If you don't know for sure, don't you accuse him, because that's wrong. And stuff. So, but yeah, on the surface, it looks like she's just upset and emotional. But if you watch all the little signs that he does, it's all there. It's just most people don't know to look for it.
And anybody caught in a conflict by an authority who's cool is your problem.
Yes. If you just got into such a fight with your significant other that you had scratches on your eyes, she's crying and shaking, and you're like, hey, what's up? Yep, everything's fine. That's weird.
On the heels, I want to address something real quick. On the heels of a lot of the Me Too stuff, and there were a lot of legit, real bad things that happened, and there were a lot of people that also have taken it too far. There's this countercultural aspect that goes along with it, where people are operating within this pretense, well, if a woman just says anything, you almost can't believe her because she has to prove this and that. We're all operating under the pretense that there is a violent situation happening, that when we're talking about this subject, that there is an instability issue, a behavioral disorder issue. If you're listening to this and you're thinking they're just jumping right to the conclusions right away that he's guilty and we're talking about situations where he is. This isn't, we're not what-ifing.
And we know he was guilty because she was dead 5 days later.
Right, exactly. Well, not just that, but I mean, even talking in the wider context of this overall series that we're doing. We are, all of us, aware that people lie. All of us are aware. That's why we're encouraging, even in leadership right now, get educated, get educated, get educated. So you can identify the body language, you can identify the word choices, you can identify the peculiarities, and you can identify what's going on. So that way, you're not believing a lying woman who's besmirching the reputation of somebody, and you're not believing a lying husband who's tuning her up every single night, and he's a cool cucumber in the face of authority, and you're thinking everything's fine. This whole situation makes me uncomfortable. I just want it to be over with. We're aware of the wider context with all of this stuff.
I think there's great need, my favorite word is nuance, to be people who can understand relationship in levels and layers. So every time you sit with a couple, you have to really pay attention to that situation, read it carefully, and just be in constant prayer to understand exactly what's happening, that you do handle it well. But to come in and have just these almost rote reactions is is defying the idea that these people have layers to them. And if this person, like these marriages we're talking about, where this person is certifiable, you have to know what you're looking at, or you're going to do it wrong. And that, I say that all the time. Get educated ahead of it, because this is going to come through your door. I've had several pastors since this incident say to me they would have handled it differently. They wouldn't have. They don't. I've never been with somebody who's actually understood this. I've never been under a pastor who's been able to recognize what this is.
If at a minimum you've never read a book about narcissism, behavioral disorders, sociopathy, you can't handle it differently because you don't understand what you're dealing with and what you're looking at. If you're a normal person, these are people that do not think anything like you. They don't act anything like you. Their motivations are entirely different than everything. They are completely alien to who you are. You will not be able to handle it differently because you're going to handle it the way a normal person would handle another normal person. That would work in that instance. When we're talking about, behavioral disorders, and it doesn't work that way.
Well, and there have been a few times in talking with just people in general conversation, they find out that I've met with somebody, and maybe it's somebody they know, maybe they just find out in general. I meet with women. They're like, well, did you encourage them to try counseling? I'm like, if you could have been in the room and hear what they're saying, the things that he said, I don't care if he hasn't threatened to hit her. That isn't even on the table. The horrible, degrading, usually sexual comments that a man has made to his wife, I'm ready to call it. That's not a guy who's going to turn around and become a great guy. This isn't a good guy. I don't know how else to spell it out. Stop treating him like he's you. He's not you. That would be...
There is a lewdness to them that's not protective of their wife. Mm-hmm. It's a sign.
And I feel like I could make a whole book of the weird things that have been said that you're like, people say that? So in line kind of with what we've kind of been ranting about is you shouldn't waver. So once it is established that harm has been done, a victim needs unwavering support and confidence. If there has been an offense, the consequential pain that comes from that offense does not become disqualified because the offender is now sorry. I would have a person in leadership say to me, I looked in his eyes, I'm afraid. I get why you're afraid. And then a week later, that same leader just happened to stop by my house unannounced and could not understand why I had a panic attack. Because if somebody comes to my door and I don't know who you are, I still think he's there to kill me. They had any kind of sense of that. What was said was, you don't actually think he'd hurt you, do you? Yeah, I do, because he said he would. It's just, don't waver. Once you have seen that there's been something done, don't waver in your support. Do not, under any circumstances, advise a woman that she has to continue a sexual relationship with a husband who has been found to have had an ongoing relationship with pornography, has made her feel unsafe, has hit her, has cheated on her, has been found to have lied to her. Basically, no authority in the church should ever make a woman feel she cannot say no. The role of leadership is advisory. It's not dictation. This happens more than people think it does. And in dealing with women, most of the time, the victim already has placed herself in that position immediately. Sometimes after finding out about an affair, they feel they need to already do that. So you are just doing damage to say that. That's not a good idea. So do not insist on face-to-face interaction with dealing with a couple who has separated under duress. If you start studying things, you will understand that toxic people play with their victim. So if you have a guy who, like in my situation, has made a strong statement, made his wife feel afraid, and then they separate, the best thing you can do is encourage that from this moment on, we're just going to communicate through emails, and we're only going to communicate about finances and kids. I did have my mentor stepped in and said that, and that was the best idea. So for 6 weeks, I didn't even shuttle the kids. My best friend took them back and forth, and I didn't have to see him. You don't, but everyone kept saying, if we could just get you in a room and we could just try a little harder, if we can get you face to face, then I think we could work this out. So don't do that. become a student. I think we've said this already, but become a student of Psychology 101. Learn about personality disorders, abusive patterns, narcissism, toxic people, and just good old manipulators. This is real, and what you don't know ahead of time will be what you have to learn on the fly. Not being ready is planning to fail women in your congregation.
Everybody's got YouTube on their phone. All you got to do is open that up, and how to identify a narcissist. I mean, start there. If you don't have time for a book, or you don't like reading and book learning, you can watch a bunch of videos and get pretty well versed in this in a weekend. To start with, not well versed enough that you're ready to take on the worst of the worst, but it's a good place to start.
This is something I think that applies in the situation. It applies to almost anyone who interacts with somebody who's come from this situation. Do not assume she has done something to be here, quote, thinking or saying things like she should have chosen better, been stronger, or left earlier, or even saying, I never would have picked that. Don't say those things. That's not helpful. Do not judge any woman who has stayed in a situation longer than you may deem she should have. Learn what survival means as a survivor. You do what you can, when you can, to stay alive and protect your children. I'm turning the page. In these situations, when people say these kinds of things, or assume these things of women, like judge how and what they did to get through, I want you to remember that if you aren't the person who's been in that, you're lucky, not smart. But that's what you think. You think you're just smarter and it would never happen to you, but you're not. You just had the good fortune to not have that experience. And so you need to be careful. You're kind.
They did not attract the attention of a predator, and that predator did not do their thing and beguile them or whatever. Correct. Yeah, it's not. They outsmarted the villains. That's not what happened.
I have quite a few things. I think we'll do like we did last week, where I'll put the whole list up, and if I think of more, I'll put them on there. But my final one, and this is something, I know Todd has a few things to say as well, but this is what I want to kind of do a little blurb for the next episode. My final advice to the leadership is leadership needs to have a correct definition of rape and abuse, all kinds of abuse, spiritual, emotional, sexual, and physical. The existing definitions are damaging and prevent the church from seeing reality. And so I would like to next week, as painful and I think uncomfortable as it's going to be, is to talk especially about what sexual abuse looks like in the marriage, in a biblical or quote biblical Christian marriage. What is going on inside these relationships is really, really, really bad. And pastors, I don't think, know that.
A lot of times good men don't have a frame of reference for the evils of the world. They don't think in those terms, and they don't actually themselves operate that way. So it's difficult for them to even understand that these things actually exist outside of almost a fictional context. And this leads, once again, it kind of goes back to what we were talking about at the very beginning, this Church of Laodicea, this spiritual blindness. It's not just spiritually blind, I don't know who Jesus is. It's spiritually blind to many of the things that my ministry's been about, which is trying to help people identify what evil actually is, what it really looks like, when it really shows up in the real world, not the way the movies present it, not the way your imagination from a 6-year-old presents it. Similarly to how, what you talk about is, this is what an actual abusive marriage looks like, and it's not like what you thought. It's not that after-school special you saw, back in your high school days, or, the villainous guy in the Hallmark movie who was like, I'll get you, that kind of thing. So when it comes to that spiritual blindness, this is a theme that keeps coming up over and over again, and we see it at multiple points in Scripture, and it all kind of refers to the same thing, the same concept. As Jesus says, in Revelation 3:16, so because you are lukewarm, you are neither hot nor cold, I am about to spit you out of my mouth. We've got, Jesus even talks about the parable of the 10 virgins, and this is in Matthew 25, 1 through 13. And this concept, there are 5 wise and 5 foolish virgins. The foolish virgins are unprepared. They fail to keep their lamps filled with oil, while the wise virgins are prepared and ready for the bridegroom's arrival. Now, this is within the Jewish ceremony, the pre-ceremony before the actual wedding. This concept, we've talked about it before on the podcast in past episodes. So when the bridegroom comes, these 5 foolish virgins, they get shut out. So once again, whether your doctrine's on once saved, always saved or not, however you want to parse that out, the point that Christ is making here is that if you're choosing to be ignorant, you're choosing to be spiritually blind, you're choosing not to acknowledge the reality of your situation, and in the point of this parable, the reality was the bridegroom was going to come at any time. The ones that are being foolish and not paying attention to the details are the ones that lose out on that. In 2 Thessalonians 2:3 warns that before the second coming of Christ, there will be a great falling away or an apostasy that happens inside of the church. Don't let anyone deceive you in any way, for that day will not come until the rebellion occurs, and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the man of doomed to destruction. We got Paul giving us a specific warning. Inside of the church, there will be a falling away at whatever time this is. My point is with that's an expression of this spiritual blindness concept. People that think that they know what they're doing and know what they're talking about, but have become so lethargic, have become so lukewarm, have become so milquetoast that they can no longer see because they no longer have the spiritual discernment to understand and recognize what's going on, where they're at, and what's happening around them.
And I think of, I don't know what episode we were doing, but Kelly, you were talking about the elders within that is the explanation and expectation to be teachable. Is
Yes.
that right? Okay. I think that is, if you are hearing this and maybe you are, your spine has kind of straightened, like, I don't really like that I'm being criticized or whatnot, I would appeal to the call and the qualification of eldership, that you would consider carefully that you are to always be a student and of your flock, honestly, that you pay attention to what's happening and that you're teachable to receive what we're saying.
I think to wrap it all up, Hebrews 12:26 through 28 or 29 gives us a really good kind of sum up of all of this. At that time, his voice shook the earth, but now he has promised, quote, once more I will shake not only the earth, but also the heavens. The words once more indicate the removing of what can be shaken, that is, created things, so that what cannot be shaken may remain. Therefore, since we receive a kingdom that cannot be shaken, let us be thankful and so worship God acceptably with reverence and awe, for our God is a consuming fire. We need to be the unshaken, or the ones that can't be shaken off. And whether that's, us communicating this message, speaking out into the void regarding this issue so that anyone with ears to hear will hear, and people will listen and see what it is that we're communicating. Or whether that's people that are in the church that feel like they're surrounded by leadership that are ineffectual and that aren't interested in doing the due diligence, learning about the subjects they need to learn it so that they can grow and get strong. I have one of my points is, when you see little growth in the leadership or membership, and most people stay in a form of like permanent spiritual infancy, maybe you are somebody in leadership that's in that situation. You need to be the one that's going to hold fast to the word. You're going to hold fast to Christ. You're not going to get shaken, because at some point, something might happen and God's going to grab the blanket and kind of give it a good shake. You need to be the one that's still holding on and not give up and keep pushing forward for what's correct and what's right.
So if you're depressed now, you can reach out to us.
Am I depressing?
No, we're just
You're
depressing.
always depressing.
Am
both
I?
of you.
I
We
thought I was
both
being
are.
optimistic just then.
I don't mind that we're depressing. I just always feel it's a good wrap up. I can just say, now that you're depressed, why don't you wrap us up, Todd?
Is it so bad?
I think we're awesome.
I always think it's funny. It's like, I feel like I'm delivering this optimistic thing, like, hold on, everything will be okay. And everybody's like, oh.
I don't know if I've ever heard you say anything optimistic. Laura did once. I asked her if she had a fever.
I think that you're outnumbered here. Your optimism needs to leave the room.
So thank you very much for sticking with us on this episode. You can reach out to either Laura, Kelly, or myself at naughty versus nice, VERSUS nice, at gmail.com. And we'll talk at you next time.